Shalom, I'm Ben Wattenberg in Tel Aviv. Behind all the headlines of the Arab-Israeli conflict, behind the intense arguments between the religious and secular Jews, there is another, more global story going on here. The Israeli economic revival can be seen as somewhat of a model in the worldwide move from state-run to market economies. The topic before the House, away from socialism, the Israeli economy. This week on Think Tank. The front page news from Israel usually involves the peace process and violence. But there is a quiet revolution going on there, a startling transformation from a semi-socialist state into a modern free market economy. Back when Israel was founded, the situation was very different.
My founding fathers who were great pioneers, great Zionists, but also great socialists, it's arguable whether they had different way to build the state underground or not, but it was built as a very centralized, very ideological, very socialist-oriented economy with a lot of state monopolies acting everywhere, beginning from trade unions and distribution, finishing with all the main spheres of industry and production.
Israel grew. Then the economy went off the rails. By 1984, inflation had hit 445%. Israel began a long process of economic recovery. Inflation was brought into check, and by the 1990s, not much above the range of normal Western levels. Unemployment has generally stayed low and is now down well below Europe's average unemployment level, despite a troubling recent uptick. Although Israel's growth has slowed in the last year, its gross domestic product has grown at almost 6% annually since 1990. That's a rate more than double that of the United States in the midst of its own economic boom, and vastly faster than the European countries. Israel's per capita GDP has already passed some European countries. It's approaching that of England. It vastly outperforms its Arab neighbors. How did this happen? Israel has few natural resources, but in the information age, that may not matter much.
It is very creative labor force. In high-tech startups, in absolute figures, we are number 2 in the world. We have more high-tech startups than all Western Europe together in absolute figures, and we are 20-25% less in absolute figures than the United States of America. So it means, of course in relative figures, we are by far number 1. It means that this flow of high-tech inventions which comes from Israel is like one big Silicon Valley.
The key to the burgeoning Israeli economy is its high-tech sector. Some familiar American names have moved in. But it's Israel's homegrown startups that are catching the world's eye. High-tech products now account for almost 25% of Israel's exports. Of the thousands of startups, one of the biggest successes is Checkpoint Software Technologies Limited, located in a suburb of Tel Aviv. We talked to its co-founder, Gil Shwed.
Our principal product is called Firewall One. It's evolved very much since what I would call an electronic door to a company network. When you have a company with a network, all the computers are connected. Once you connect this network to a public network, like the internet, immediately every computer becomes part of a huge network and becomes accessible to the rest of the world. And immediately all your databases, all your servers becomes accessible to the rest of the world, which have some security risks in it. What Firewall One does is sits between the internal network and the public network and simply enforces the company policy. It says who can go out, which people from the company can access the internet and what they can do, which applications or which sites they can access, and which people can go in, like sending an email connecting to the company mail server or getting to the company worldwide website.
We asked Shwed what it was about Israel that makes it such a fertile ground for high-tech startups like his.
Trying to analyze why Israel became important or why there are so many startups or so many technologies companies in Israel, I think there are several reasons. The first one is that we have a lot of talented people. Education is important. We have very educated people. Many countries have a lot of educated people, but what we also have, or what we don't have, is a local market. So if I want to start a company that's going to be successful and a large company, I have to look at the global markets. And I have no local one. I can't start just with Tel Aviv and then grow from Tel Aviv to surrounding countries. So I have to look globally. I have to look to the US market or to the European market. And when I do that, I create a global high-tech company which has the chance of success.
When Benjamin Netanyahu was elected Prime Minister of Israel in 1996, he promised to further deregulate the Israeli economy and further increase the influence of the free market. He said this about the new Israeli economy: "We shall establish in Israel, listen well to my words, we shall establish in Israel a truly free economy that is not governed by political operatives or by bureaucrats, an economy that does not hinder enterprise." As part of the global economy, Israel has lowered trade barriers and moved toward making its currency, the shekel, fully convertible and tradable. As in many nations going through pro-market changes, critics claim that the poor and middle class are being shortchanged. Sharansky is an elected politician. He squares the circle this way.
I wouldn't say it's inaccurate. No doubt that as we are under strong pressure of reality, when there are coming a lot of people who have some immediate elementary needs, because people, even when they're coming, they were taking very good positions, successful careers and so on, they are coming without knowing language, without any property, without any connections in the society, without any income of their parents which could help them to start. And especially old people are coming without their pensions which they were receiving. So the most elementary thing, like getting an apartment, has to be met.
To find out how the move away from socialism is going in Israel, we talked in Jerusalem to two pro-market experts coming from somewhat different perspectives. Daniel Doron, president of the Israel Center for Social and Economic Progress, and Amotz Asa-El, associate editor of the Jerusalem Post, where he tracks Israel's economic fortunes. When I have been in Israel in the past, going back from 1990 and earlier, one would hear from Israelis, they would say, well, you know, this is a poor country. It's not like America, it's not like Europe, it's a poor country. Now you come here, and you hear people saying, you know, we're a rich country now. It's like Europe. And some of the statistics say the standard of living is as high as in the United Kingdom or as Italy. And there are, 90 Israeli companies on the NASDAQ stock exchange. And you come out of Tel Aviv driving here toward Jerusalem and you see crane after crane after crane building going on. So what's happened? Why don't you start and then let's talk.
I would say that the big first change, Israel is not its cause but its result. I think that world economies that in the past used to prosper due to their possession of raw materials, of ostensibly scarce raw materials, seem to prosper. And you can have such instances all over the world, from Zambia with its copper to Nigeria with its oil. And there came a point somewhere in the course of the 80s when the world discovered that the possession of raw materials is not necessarily a recipe for panacea. In fact, it can even be detrimental in the long term to when it comes to prosperity. The inversion of this principle was that the lack of raw materials can ultimately be a blessing because it compels the society to seek other sources of income, namely knowledge-intensive ones like the ones that we here apparently efficiently utilize.
You buy that?
Yes, definitely. I think that our major source of wealth is our human capital. Israel has more scientists in absolute and relative number than Switzerland. We are the second in the world in the proportion of people that are graduates of MIT after the United States. And we are first in the world in the publication of scientific papers per capita. However, we have had institutional arrangements until now. They are slowly changing, but too slowly, too painfully, that have inhibited this tremendous wealth that we had and didn't allow it to prosper the way
For example, what were the restraints that you had and still have?
Well, socialism and statism were the major reasons. I mean, Israel has perhaps now arguably the most concentrated economy in the Western world.
What does that mean, concentrated?
It means that most assets are owned by a very small group of people. Until recently, it was mostly owned by government and public bodies like the Labor Federation. And recently, through the process of privatization, a lot of those assets were sold, some of them through sweetheart deals, to about 20 families that at the moment control most assets. We cannot keep acting like lumbering, monopolistic elephants. We must become racehorses. I would like to add...
That's how you would describe the old socialists.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Lumbering elephants.
That's right.
They say we build a state. It was all desert and we built a state.
And no question asked about efficiency, about the cost, about the price. Those were things that were not mentioned in Israel. I mean, the end product mattered, and it didn't matter what you had to pay for it, how much it cost you. Regarding the wealth,
I should mention that layoffs were anathema. Layoffs were unthinkable, certainly not massive ones. Such kind of rationalization it was a given that you wouldn't go through such a thing.
Now, do you have major layoffs now?
We've certainly gone through a period of major layoffs back in the late 80s. Now, I wouldn't say that the macroeconomy demands that kind of thing, but you do see that in the rapidly vanishing low-tech industries. It's not massive on the scale of thousands of employees, but every now and then you hear of a plant on the order of a few hundreds of employees that shuts down because the production lines are migrating beyond the border to much cheaper labor markets.
I want to add a few words about the question of wealth. You know, Israel potentially could be one of the wealthiest countries in the world, if not the wealthiest, according to the quality of its human capital and the proven achievements of its human capital. Where have you got a country that is the size of New Jersey, with a population of greater Philadelphia, that can produce a first-line fighter aircraft, a first-line battle tank, imaging equipment that is first in the world, the most advanced software, irrigation systems, you name it, the Israelis are at the cutting edge. And yet the Israeli worker is still earning an average $1,500 a month.
One must also bear in mind that Israel's leadership back then, including David Ben-Gurion himself, were very economically poorly educated people, not to say completely uneducated, and he at least had a law degree. Some of his peers had no formal higher education whatsoever. So they did the best they could, and the accomplishments are nothing to scoff at.
But they followed, I mean, they may not have been economists, but they were following the basic drift of developed world economics, the British Fabian socialists.
Not really, no. Their intellectual homeland was Russia, not Fabian socialism. Russian Bolshevism was their home. And let's say in their favor, if you were a poor Jew around the turn of the century, you know, Jews were then destitute. They lived in abysmal poverty because of terrible political and racist attitudes of the Russian government. Now, if you saw this as a free enterprise system that oppresses you, that grinds you to the bone, naturally you would fall for the siren song of socialism. Socialism then looked to Bertrand Russell, to George Bernard Shaw, to a lot of very smart people as the promise of the future. The question is not anymore the ideology, but the actual formation of the Israeli elites. And this is the real story of this country. I was a graduate of the first class of economics at the Hebrew University after the War of Liberation. We had Professor Patinkin, an American economist that was a disciple of Paul Samuelson.
Right. This was what,
1949, 50.
Right.
And we were taught then that you can fine-tune an economy. But my comrades that were the best and the brightest are the ones that ground the Israeli economy to the ground simply because of this foolish belief that you can have a command economy, that government can really control economic processes. You know, that you can fine-tune it here, adjust interest rates here,
Right,
that you can decide better than the entrepreneur where to invest in something. Now, this has become the problem of Israel, is its bureaucracy. We have now powerful vested interests in the bureaucracy, in the Bank of Israel, in the Treasury, whose colleagues are now
but the Bank of Israel, I mean, you have gone from 445% inflation to what, 5%
Roughly,
inflation?
right now,
5% inflation. So they must have been doing something right. These terrible bureaucrats
on
that Daniel is talking about.
On the inflation side, they've been wonderful. That was the one battle that our very bright Jacob Frankel gave all his heart to, because that's his reference groups are other central bankers, and control of inflation is the name of the game. So that's where he spends all his energy and all his might, and he has done nobly. I mean, he resisted tremendous political pressure. However, the cost was that he neglected almost totally the deregulation of financial markets in Israel.
Let's move on from this point in history that we were discussing, where socialism hits a wall, where both parties or one and a half parties, everybody sort of gets the idea that it doesn't work anymore. And then we come to one simple two-syllable word, which is Bibi. Okay, now my recollection of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who I've known over the years, is the thing that he got most passionate about Israel was economics, was not the land. He was really saying we got to break up all the things that you've been saying, by the way. And this goes back to 1990 and the mid-1980s and the terrorism conference in 1970.
You can have the choice, either fools never differ or great minds think alike.
Right.
So.
Okay, now, what kind of a job has he done?
He spent the first at least few months and probably the entire first year of his office surviving, and only once the second year began, he began thinking of how more systematically on how to get along and continue with his own agenda. Meanwhile, a very economic...
Which is a Thatcherite agenda, basically.
Absolutely. A very positive thing that happened, strictly economically speaking, is that Foreign Minister David Levy left the government. He was the holdover from the old populist Likud. He embodied that attitude, and coming from his background, we don't want to discuss him now. The point is that with him gone, there is hardly anyone within this cabinet who, when an asset is on the counter for sale, will be as contrarian as he could have been in such pivotal moments. The big bones of contentions have yet to be attacked, like the Electric Corporation, which is probably bound to end up being, either sooner or later under Bibi or under his successor, Israel's equivalent of what the coal miners were for Thatcher.
Bibi, of course, came unprepared because nobody can be prepared to govern the Israeli government. First of all,
there was no Keith Joseph to play to his stature.
Not only that. The Israeli government is really a misnomer. I believe governments everywhere are a misnomer. If you think of government as an entity that has some kind of cohesiveness and a set of coherent goals that it wants to execute, like any other body, there ain't such a thing as government. Government is simply an unstable coalition of vested interests that are pulling this way and that in every country, and especially in Israel, where everything is arbitrated through government. The source of wealth in Israel is government. Government contacts, government contracts, you name it. You get it through your government and through your political connections. So everything here is politicized. From the size of the donut that we buy on Hanukkah, that is determined by the government, that tells us how much gem can be in it, to the interest rates and the foreign exchange rate. Right. Now, since the Israeli government has to arbitrate between so many vested interests, it's always torn apart. It has torn apart the two large parties. Both of them and I predicted that both of them in the next elections would just decline as has happened indeed, because they fight each other constantly and they are incapable of producing anything. They are incapable of carrying out any policy. I've seen it from inside now. The same for privatization. I mean, there is no reason why a government in Israel should succeed in privatizing more than it succeeds in its educational system, which in a Jewish state to create such a educational system is a real shande, as they say.
Scandal.
Or the health system, we have the highest rate of doctors per capita in the world and some of the finest Jewish doctors. And yet we have one of the worst health delivery systems because
You agree with that, Amotz?
it's a bureaucracy.
Well, now hold on. You're saying this as a great theoretical economist. You talk to Israelis, and they say we have this wonderful national health system.
They don't know the alternatives. Look, every Israeli feels that he's very rich because he drives a Subaru that cost him $30,000. So he feels he drives a Cadillac. It costs $30,000. He has an apartment in Jerusalem that cost him $250,000. So he thinks he's a very wealthy man. They don't, look, the Talmud says that the worm that lives inside the horseradish thinks that it's the sweetest fruit.
Israelis don't know how exorbitantly taxed they are. They may know that theoretically, but we are perhaps the most heavily taxed society in the developed world when you take into account not just income taxes, but a host of indirect taxes, ranging from value-added tax to car sales taxes, or to a host of property-related taxes, which you pay whether as an owner, or as a buyer, or as a seller. There's no end to this. It's a plethora of taxes.
As by the luck of the draw here, we have three people who think that the adjective Thatcherite is a compliment. Now, but there's a lot of people in Israel who are not Thatcherites, like probably about 90% if I had to guess.
Right.
Now, if I had assembled this panel differently with non-Thatcherites, play a game for me. What is the argument against what is going on in Israel now?
Well, I can just quote it, but don't anyone even think that I think so myself.
Okay, but what do you hear? What do you hear from the
opponents of Thatcherism would clearly say is they would make this mechanical linkage between Israel's currently rising unemployment and this government's Thatcherist talk and whatever action of it there is. I would quickly say, of course, that this is economically unfounded. The reason unemployment is currently rising, the rise isn't that dramatic. The reason it's rising is that the economy is basically undergoing a historic shift from a low-tech dominated structure to a high-tech dominated one, and surely in the course of that, there are those who fall by the wayside, and meanwhile also due to fortunate political developments, also labor-intensive production lines can go across the border.
Now you play a socialist here for me, or a welfare state economist. It's hard.
I've been waiting many years to hear
the first time in history, but tell me what the other side would say.
Well, I think Israelis are really very bothered about inequality of income. And they don't realize that the inequality, the great gaps of income that we have in Israel are created precisely by the statist and socialist system, that concentrates wealth in the hands of the few. They are also, you must realize, Israelis have been trained to look at the world through a very different prism. I mean, they were educated on Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, on The Grapes of Wrath, and
Grapes of Wrath, not
Wrath. I'm sorry. On Dallas, and on American magazines that talk about what a failure America is, because your cities are full with the homeless, and drunks. So Israelis say, well, look, this is the model of capitalism, and it's failed, and socialism has succeeded. Look at Sweden, for example, the nicest society. It's socialist, and socialism is coming back now in Europe. It has gained the government in Britain. They don't, of course, realize that socialism was somewhat transformed in Britain or in other places. So you have this simplistic view, and you have still mostly the concern of the Israelis about equality. Okay. This is a community that needs cohesion, and therefore equality is very important.
Now, thank you very much, Daniel Doron and Amotz Asa-El. You're wonderful guests. You're not such great socialists. I mean, in terms of making a case for socialism.
We might still grow up.
We might still grow up. But thank you very much. And thank you for Think Tank I'm Ben Wattenberg.
We at Think Tank depend on your views to make our show better. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. Or email us at thinktank@pbs.org. To learn more about Think Tank, visit PBS online at www.pbs.org. And please let us know where you watch Think Tank. This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.